your GP or your HP? What's it gonna be? Today, let's talk about villains on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Happy Halloween, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark, and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller who preps for every game by spending at least 5 minutes doing an evil villain chuckle. Welcome to my channel, where we talk about role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today, for Halloween, we are going to be talking about one of the best parts of storytelling, writing villains. So if you are new to the channel, this video is part of an ongoing series that I'm doing that is aimed towards storytellers, especially towards newer storytellers who are working on crafting their campaign. In this series, we look at the critical elements that go into building an RPG campaign. We talk about those elements both on their own and in regards to how they relate to the other elements of storytelling. And we talk about how you can craft your campaign, how you can craft your story, and how you can build an experience that your players are going to remember. Today we're going to be talking about what is easily one of the most enjoyable aspects of writing for an RPG game, which is writing villains. I'll go ahead and say that writing villains is probably one of the easiest things that we get to do as storytellers, just because it's so much fun. There's just something enjoyable about crafting the look and personality and motives and plan of a good villain, and creating that character that your players are going to hate is truly one of the most fun things that you get to do behind a DM screen. But just because it's fun doesn't mean that there aren't pitfalls that we need to be aware of. So today we're going to talk about villains. We're going to talk about how to craft them. We're going to talk about some different types of villains. We're going to look at villains both as a singular storytelling element, and then we're going to go and we're going to talk about how villains relate to the other elements of storytelling that are part of this series. And we're going to look at how to create villains that are truly memorable and enjoyable, and most importantly, that bring a lot of depth and interest to the story that you are creating. So, let's get started. Now, when we talk about villains, one of the first things that we need to talk about is how we're going to classify our villains. And let me just start by saying there are a lot of different ways that you can classify your villains. This video is hardly going to be an exhaustive list, but when I think about villains, I kind of like to think about morality. I know it's kind of an old school writing concept, but I feel like this is something that has stuck around for a long time because it is a very engaging concept in and of itself. Villains are a really great place where you can think about what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, and you can really bring to light the concept of morality that your players may have to engage with in your story. Again, this is not the only way to write villains, but it is one of the ways that I enjoy looking at it. So today, I'm going to be classifying villains into 4 different groups as they kind of relate to the concept of morality. So with that in mind, my 4 groups are antagonist by circumstance, the compromised villain, the immoral villain, and the amoral villain, or what you may sometimes hear referred to as the force of nature villain. So, the first group that I have is antagonist by circumstance, and the title of this group of villains is very important because it helps us kind of step back and take a bigger picture look at what villains are in our role-playing games. Villains are antagonists. They are people who oppose our players. And it is that opposition to our players, it is that relationship where either the villain's going to succeed or your players are going to succeed, but one of those groups is leaving the outcome of the confrontation disappointed. Well, that is the nature of antagonism. Villains in RPG games at their core are characters that are antagonistic, that are working against your party. Now, we know that a good villain probably has schemes far larger and far bigger than just what your players are dealing with. But it is important to look at that dynamic relationship, that antagonistic relationship, to really help define your villains and make them something that is going to be memorable to your players. You see, it's not just important for your villain to be doing some big bad evil plan. It's important for your villain to be doing something that is going to make your players hate them. Mild spoiler warning for the very old game Final Fantasy VII. Probably one of the best examples of this ever is Sephiroth from Final Fantasy VII. He is a classic villain in so many ways, and he has this dramatic plan to scar the world and cause all kinds of catastrophic loss of life so that he can become the equivalent to a deity in that particular world. Sephiroth is a fantastic example of this almost cosmic power level villain. But if you're anything like me, there was a specific moment where you hated Sephiroth. Yeah, the moment he killed Eris. It was that moment that Sephiroth took action not against the world, but against your party that really made him stick in your mind, in your heart, and really made you want to take him down in that game. And when we talk about villains, that's important. If you want your players to be invested in the story, they have to have a stake in taking down the villain, not just because they're stopping the villain from doing these big, bad, terrible things, but because the villain has done something personal to them. So when we think about villains, one of the big principles is there needs to be an antagonistic nature between your players and the villain. Establishing that relationship is very important. Now, that is a big scale picture, so let's shrink things back down a bit and talk about this category a little more in depth. We're talking right now about antagonists by circumstance. The first category of villains are characters that might not, under normal circumstance, be a villain in a story. Many of the villains that we use in RPG games aren't villainous, they're not necessarily bad people, but their relationship with the player characters is such that they will always be antagonistic towards the player characters. There are several easy examples that you can think of when you look at this category. Let's start with the guard captain. If you're running a fairly standard group of murder hobos, or if you've got the world's most basic kleptomaniac thief in your party, there is a pretty good chance that the captain of the guard in your town is going to be antagonistic towards your PCs. Many of the villains, many of the antagonists that we use in role-playing games are not necessarily bad people, but their relationship to the party sets them at odds with the party. And there are a lot of great ways that you can use this in storytelling. You can actually create very relatable, very interesting, very deep characters that are going to be opposed to the party and use them in your stories. Here's a simple example. Imagine that your party is being sent to recover some ancient artifact with important plot-relevant powers that they're going to need down the road in the campaign. Now, imagine that you have a very noble and honorable knight from the next kingdom over who is leading his own group to recover that exact same artifact. Suddenly, you have a character who, in normal circumstances, might be an ally for the PCs, but because their goal and the party's goal are at odds with one another, they are by nature antagonistic. When you are writing villains, always be mindful that sometimes the best antagonists are not necessarily going to be the most classical evil character concepts. Sometimes you can create interesting areas and gray moral dilemmas by putting your party at odds with otherwise decent characters who just happen to be operating on a goal that is at odds with your party. But it's Halloween, so let's move on to some more interesting and some more classically villainous concepts. Let's look at the second group, which I'm going to call the compromised villain. Now, what makes the compromised villain different from the previous group is this. The compromised villain is very clearly evil, or at least engaging in evil actions. The compromised villain does bad things, and the party is going to be motivated to stop them. But the nuance of the compromised villain is this: their motivation is very understandable. A compromised villain is a villain who is driven to do bad things for, if not good reasons, at least understandable reasons. This is a concept that you might see in a lot of stories, a character who is driven by desperation or addiction or a number of different things to do bad stuff. Imagine an assassin who is forced to kill because an organization holds his family hostage. He is driven to commit murder not because he is hostile to the targets, but rather because he's trying to save his family. The important thing to realize is a compromised villain is someone who is being pushed by someone or something else to do something they wouldn't normally do. This dynamic is very powerful in storytelling because it creates both tension and provides some narrative flexibility that you don't see with other types of villains. The narrative tension is obvious. Your villain is being driven by something. So when we deal with the compromised villain, you're almost always dealing with a villain who is very driven to do whatever it is they're going to do in a relatively quick time frame. The assassin example that I gave earlier, they probably have to take down their target within a very narrow time frame or their family's going to bite it. So if your players are dealing with a compromised villain, there is almost always going to be some immediacy, some very real and present and clear danger to what the villain is doing. But the other side of the coin here, and this is probably one of the more interesting aspects of this type of villain, is the possibility of redemption, or at the very least, the option to stop the villain through different means. Let's go back to our assassin. One way to stop the assassin is to corner him and beat him in a fight. Another way to stop the assassin is to learn about what's happening with his family and go rescue them. The nature of the villain provides multiple ways to deal with the problem that the villain is causing in the story. If a compromised villain is being pushed to do something they wouldn't normally do, then if you can address whatever is pushing them, you can change the outcome of the story. And so compromised villains are, I think, a very important concept to deal with as a storyteller. In fact, I want to pause here and talk a little bit about a good writing versus bad writing thing that I just see quite often in wider media, and that is the concept of the relatable villain. One of my rules in writing villains is this: it's not about making a relatable villain, it's about making an understandable villain. You want their motives, you want their drive, you want their plan to make sense. Who they are and what motivates them should logically drive them to what they do. I feel like a lot of writers go to extremes trying to make their villains relatable, and in the end, make their villains illogical, and it harms stories. However, if you want to make a relatable villain, it can be an effective tool, and the way you make a relatable villain a positive element of your story is you make them an understandable relatable villain, and that's what the compromised villain is. They are relatable because you recognize that they are being driven by something that normally would not drive them to the actions they are performing. So the second category, compromised villains, is a very powerful category and something that you can really get some good mileage out of as a storyteller. Let's move on to the third category, and let's ramp up the evil a little bit here and go with the immoral villain. This is a character who is being driven by their own nature rather than by something external to themselves to commit evil acts. There is no external situation with these villains that is pushing them to do their terrible deeds. It is their own immoral flaws that cause them to perform their own actions. And the great thing about this category of villains is this is where you kind of get to go big as a storyteller. When you start talking about immoral villains, you start talking about characters that their motivations may not be as deep, but their actions can be a lot more fun. Because their actions are being driven by their own nature, they can go to extremes that the previous types of villains might normally avoid. The compromised assassin will kill, sure, but they're not acting with malice. However, a character that enjoys violence is going to seek out opportunities. It's the difference between the assassin and the serial killer. We're talking about villains that can really display some of the worst attributes of humanity, and man oh man, as a storyteller, is this where you get to have some fun. Trying to hunt down the cult leader, the serial killer, taking down the greedy businessman. These stories can be a lot of fun because good and evil are very clear-cut in these types of stories. You have a character who is being driven by very dark motivations, and your players get to oppose that. And by and large, it's very clean-cut. It's very clear who's right, who's wrong. We're going to talk about this a little bit more here in a moment, but this category of villain can sometimes come across as a little bit shallow. But I think it's important to include villains like this in our stories because it is just engaging. It's something of a trope, but it's a fun trope and it's something we enjoy. Your players probably don't want to wrestle with the moral implications of taking down a bandit every single game session. It's fairly easy to make bandits violent and greedy, and yeah, they're clear-cut and shallow characters, but it's still a fun encounter for your players to have. But we've got to ramp it up a little bit more because it's Halloween, and if you're a fan of this channel, you probably know my personality right now. We have to get to the cream of the crop. We have to get to the upper echelon of villains. We have to get to the villains who are so big and world-consuming that they represent a force that is just devastating beyond anything a regular human villain might accomplish. Let's talk about amoral or force of nature villains. Now, let me be clear. When I say amoral here, I don't mean that these villains are neutral aligned. These villains can very quickly and obviously be categorized as something blatantly evil. The point of this fourth category is not necessarily human morality. The point of this category is the scale of the evil. This is something that has stepped outside of the bounds of normal human thought, and now we're dealing with something that is truly catastrophic. Now, there are examples of amoral, meaning more neutral examples of villains, but the key here is the villain is always going to be something the players need to stop, and they need to stop right now. For a basic example of a force of nature scale villain, you can look at the plane of Zendikar in Magic the Gathering. The plane itself in that particular setting is almost its own character. The royal in that story is this chaotic energy inherent to the plane that makes it difficult, if not outright dangerous, for true communities to form. Humanity is suffering because of the very nature of Zendikar. Is Zendikar evil? Is Zendikar good? Or is it just dangerous? This is what we're talking about. Category 4 villains, the amoral, the force of nature villains, these are the things that have stepped outside normal human concerns. They still need to be confronted, they still need to be dealt with, but we're talking about something that is outside of your average, everyday human thought process. Now, there are very easy examples of evil force of nature style villains. An easy example from video games would be Diablo in the Diablo series. When you are crusading against Diablo in that game series, you're not dealing with normal human concerns, you're dealing with potentially world-ending threats, but the line between good and evil is still very clear-cut. So those are my 4 basic categories of villains. The antagonist by circumstance, the compromised villain, the immoral villain, and the amoral or force of nature villain. And I want to talk a little bit for a moment about how these different categories relate, because when we think about villains, there are a couple of important concepts here. First off, villains don't have to stay in just one category. It is very easy to imagine a villain that moves between 1, 2, 3, or possibly even all 4 of these different categories throughout the course of a campaign. Let's return to one of my antagonists by circumstance, the Honorable Knight from the Next Kingdom Over. Very clearly, at the start of your story, they would be a Category 1 villain. They are not truly evil, they're just antagonistic because of the conflicting goals between your party and them. However, you can imagine as the story progresses that this character might begin to move through some of the other categories. Maybe as the story develops, the Honorable Knight becomes driven by a violent nationalism or other political affiliation that causes them to compromise their own honor. They are being pushed by an exterior force to do things that they wouldn't normally do, and so they move from the first to the second category. Now imagine, as the story develops, that they find that honor is weakness, and they develop a very tyrannical outlook that might makes right, and there is no other concept that they need to worry about when it comes to their morality, and they begin to actively oppress people in their quest to obtain this particular artifact that is core to your story. Suddenly, they're not being driven by an external force, but their own immoral flaws are instead driving them to do terrible things. They've stepped up another category. Now imagine that this long corrupted knight gets to the artifact first, uses it, and is possessed by ancient, terrible, evil number 4827 who plans to destroy the world. Suddenly, what started as an antagonist by circumstance is now a force of nature scale villain. Villains can and do move between these categories, and when you're writing your villains for your stories, don't look at these as hard categories that they have to stay in. Look at these different categories as ways to help understand the drive and motivation of your villains. The second thing I want to talk about with this particular scale is, as you move up and down this scale, you're going to find that it affects your stories in different ways. The farther down this scale you go, for lack of a better term, the more epic your story becomes. You could kind of see, as I was describing these different categories, as you move from antagonist to compromise to immoral to force of nature, that you are naturally scaling up how terrible and evil a given circumstance is. You are essentially raising the stakes. Narratively, this is very powerful. What starts out as a minor conflict between your party and another individual inside the game world can escalate into something that is threatening a city, a region, a country, maybe even the world itself. As you move through through these categories, you will see that you are naturally escalating the scale of the conflict and, as a result, the level of tension inherent to your story. However, as we've mentioned a couple of times going through this scale, the further down the scale you get, the easier it is for your villains to fall flat, for their motivations to become almost cardboard cutouts. It's very easy to lose the nuance of a good villain the further down the scale you go. I talked about earlier, one of the key rules to writing a good villain is to write an understandable villain. And if you escalate too quickly, you can lose that understandable aspect to your villain, making them honestly not that important to your story. So when you reverse the process and begin to go up the scale, what you find is that you can develop more complex villains. The further down the scale you go, the more you're escalating stakes and tension, but the further up the scale you go, the more you are creating complexity in the antagonist that your players have to deal with. Looking at the scale, one of the questions you may want to ask is, at what point does a villain move from a redeemable villain to an irredeemable villain? At what point in the progression of our tyrannical knight earlier did that knight become an irredeemable villain, someone that the party needs to kill because they cannot save? If the knight is in category 1 or category 2, it is very arguable that they are redeemable, that they can be brought back from the brink. Category 3, though, it's very iffy. They have embraced evil at a level that makes it harder to redeem them or restore them. So that's the dynamic that's at play here. Moving down the list increases the scale, the tension of the story, but moving up the list increases the complexity and kind of the moral nuance to the tale that you're crafting. So when you're thinking about your villains, be willing to both escalate and de-escalate your villains to move them up and down the scale to help add complexity or narrative tension to the story that you're crafting. But now, with that in mind, let's take a look at villains as they relate to the other elements of storytelling. So now we're going to talk about how the element of story writing villains relates to the other elements of story writing that we use in our role-playing games. And the other elements that we're going to talk about today are location, treasure, PC backstory, the goalpost sessions, and style and theme. So, how do villains relate to these other elements of the story, and how can we look at these different pieces of storytelling together to create a story that is more engaging overall? Let's start with villains and locations. Now, I feel a little bit bad here, but we already talked about the villain's lair in the location video, so we've already kind of hit that subject, but let me just emphasize again, have some fun with that villain's lair. If you're going to have an evil overlord in your game, they need an appropriately tyrannical location to rule from. However, for this video, we're asking, how do villains impact the other elements of storytelling? And in particular, how do villains impact location? Well, there is a single question that I think you need to consider as a storyteller here, and that is, how do villains make the location worse? Villains are the bad guys, right? They are the people that we're trying to stop, they are the people that we oppose, they are the people that the player characters need to take down. They are bad, so if they are bad, why are they bad? What are they doing to make the world around them worse? If a villain moves into the city, why is that city going to be worse off? This question is actually a very important question in establishing the villain's relationship to the world and to the player characters, and it has a powerful impact on the feel of your story. For a really good example of this, I love how Paizo has used the nation of Cheliax in their Golarion campaign setting. Cheliax is a stereotypical evil fantasy empire. That is literally the role Cheliax is intended to play in their story. You have a bunch of tyrannical diabolists aligned with the evil Church of Asmodeus. You have them as one of the major participants in slavery in the Golarion campaign setting. They are the bad guys, and you can tell they are the bad guys by the tyrannical oppression that they bring to any region they manage to conquer. And all of those elements are powerful in establishing why players would be opposed to Cheliax and why they would work against the government of that particular nation. If you look at the story of Cheliax, Paizo did a good job of making Cheliax an understandable villain. The nation was thrown into disarray when the deity Eridan failed to show back up in that setting's timeline. The society was thrown into complete and utter disarray, and you had a nation that was descending into chaos, and the rise of House Thrune brought order and stability back to a very chaotic country. It's a very understandable progression how you move from a relatively neutral society to a very lawful evil society in that campaign setting. Paizo made an understandable villain, but they made sure that their understandable villain was still very clearly a villain. If you want to establish who the bad guy is in your campaign, you need to make it clear that they make the world around them worse. There are a lot of ways you can do this. There are a myriad of possible things that bad guys can do, so I'm not going to hit all of those topics, but just take some time and think about the world that your characters operate in and ask, why are things worse now that this villain is here? Next up, we have villains and treasure. And oh boy, I've looked forward to this one, because when you think about villains and treasure, there is a very obvious overlap between these two things. The cursed item. As a storyteller, is there anything more enjoyable than dropping a cursed item on your party? They've had their magic swords and magic armor, they've had their cool rings and wizard staves, they've had all of these fantastic items that they've gotten to use on their adventures, and into the pile you just drop this inconspicuous item that's going to make your party loathe you. Cursed items introduce paranoia into games in a fantastic way, and as a DM, they can be a lot of fun to use, but it's a little bit tricky because why are all these cursed items just laying around? Cursed items are a fun storytelling element, but it can be a narrative stretch to find a way to include them realistically in your game. But villains, they write that story for you. Villains are all about corrupting things. Villains are all about using evil tools for their own gain. Villains are the kinds of people who are going to actively bring these terrible items into your game, and one of the easiest ways you can clearly delineate who a villain is just by giving them some cursed or evil items for them to use. A soul-stealing sword may be a moral dilemma for the party, but the villain has no problem using that artifact in their quest for power. If you want to drop some cursed items into a game, villains are a great way to do that. And when your villain goes down, it creates some interesting moral dilemmas for your party as they have to decide what are they going to do with those terrible artifacts that they found. Do they try to use those artifacts for good and try to stave off the corruption that those items and artifacts might impose? Or do they try to destroy the cursed item and cursed artifacts? In fact, in a lot of fantasy role-playing games, the definition of an artifact is a magical item that is extremely difficult to destroy, meaning that the story of getting rid of a cursed artifact can be almost an entire campaign arc in and of itself. And depending on the nature of your PCs, you can put some very real tension in your story of, this artifact is really, really valuable, but probably needs to be destroyed. I'm sure no storytellers have ever used that particular ploy before. So when we think about villains and treasure, one of the fun things that you can think about is villains and the cursed items or cursed artifacts that they can bring into your story. Now next up is probably one of the more difficult pairs of puzzle pieces to put together, and that's villains and player character backstories. And the reason that this is difficult to put together is you can really stretch the suspension of disbelief if you do this poorly. Now don't get me wrong, Scar is one of my top 3 Disney villains of all time, so I love a good I killed Mufasa. The idea of the main villain being personally responsible for the tragedy that one of your players suffered in their backstory, that is a golden thing. And if you can make it work logically within the framework of your story, go for it. There is nothing wrong with giving a personal connection from your villain to your player character. Let the villain do something terrible to the PC in their backstory. If it makes sense, go for it. But it is difficult to write a story realistically where your villain has personally traumatized every single player character in their backstory before the campaign even began. That really strains what is credible in writing. Establishing those personal relationships in the backstory of your campaign can be very difficult. But that doesn't mean that your villains and your PC backstories are never going to connect. In fact, connecting these two pieces is one of the best ways to establish a very threatening villain. And it works like this. Your villain can and should research your PCs. Especially if it is the main villain of your campaign. If we're talking about the BBEG, the big bad evil guy of whatever story you are telling, if your players are going to repeatedly interfere with whatever it is that your villain is doing, they're going to catch the villain's notice, and as a result, your villain should be motivated to figure out who these adventurers are and why they keep interfering with his plans, and most importantly, what he can do about them. Having your villain research your player characters and bring that research to light during the course of a campaign can be a very jarring moment emotionally for your players. In one of my campaigns, one of my players had a very close relationship with their character's grandfather. It was the most important relationship in their life, and in an encounter with the main villain threw out a threat against that PC's grandfather. And suddenly the villain went from this bad guy that, we probably should stop, to someone that this character had a personal stake in stopping. A force of nature villain became a very personal villain in that campaign, and it was one of the best role-playing sessions when that character just flew into a rage and attacked the villain when and how they probably should not have. The villain researching his opponent was a powerful, powerful way to get my player invested in that villain. So if you want to connect your villain to your player character's backstory, they don't necessarily have to be connected at the start of the game, but as the game progresses, your villain can learn about your players and use that information against them. Is your character ashamed because they fled from a battlefield when they were young? Have the villain bring that shame up to embarrass them in a social setting. Did your villain discover that your players have a particular fear? Well, guess what the villain is going to throw at that player at the start of the next encounter. And of course there is a classic, if somewhat overused, have the villain threaten the people that the player character loves. Having your villain research your players shows that your villain is intelligent, that they are conniving, and creates personal stakes. You can have personal connections between villains and PCs. They don't have to exist at the start of the campaign in order to be meaningful. Next up is the villain and the goalposts, as I like to refer to them. And if you've been watching this series, you know that I refer to the goalpost of your campaign as the opening scenario and the final confrontation. The goalposts are the first thing and the last thing that your players are going to experience in your campaign, so they are, by definition, going to have a powerful impact on how well your campaign is remembered. And as a result, thinking about the villains in those two moments, in those two encounters, is going to be very important in establishing the tone of your game, the story that you're trying to tell, and determining how memorable your game is going to be. Now, obviously, the main villain of the campaign is probably going to show up in the final encounter. If they're not in the final encounter, they're probably in the penultimate encounter immediately before that. Your party may have to do something after defeating the main villain, but you definitely want to save the main villain till the very end of the campaign, or almost the very end of the campaign. That antagonistic relationship is so core to your player's investment in the story that you really want to play that out as long as you can. So we know the main villain is going to be at or close to one of the goalposts, the final session, but the opening scenario of your campaign, you want to make sure that you have an engaging villain there as well. This is a really good place for that very first category of villains I talked about earlier, the antagonist by circumstance. Opening scenarios are the kind of scenarios where you don't necessarily want to go big, but you do want to go memorable. And so using antagonists that in other circumstances may not be enemies of the party can be a very memorable situation. In one of my campaigns, my opening scenario had a violent tribe of rat folk that were attacking my party and the Pathfinder Society group that they were traveling with. In that particular scenario, the rat folk were trying to defend their lands and mistakenly believed that my players were hostile to them. So it was a very nuanced and diplomatically tense situation as that kind of played out between the two groups. But I wanted to make sure I had a very engaging villain in that opening story, and being hunted by savage rat folk tribes in the middle of a jungle while trying to escape a flood, that was a memorable scenario. Now, something I would like to highlight here is how well a villain can connect the two goalposts of your stories. The villains in your opening story very often can be manipulated by or driven by the larger villain of your campaign. The person that the party is going to face in their final moments in the story could be pulling the levers and manipulating the situation from the very first moment that your players interact with your game world. And that common thread of the villain's schemes is one of the easiest ways to move from the first goalpost, the opening session, to the final goalpost, the final confrontation of your story. So when you're thinking about these two pieces and how they fit together, the way you move from your opening scenario to your final confrontation is quite often going to be determined by your villain's scheme. So think about, what is your villain planning? What is your villain doing? What are their goals? And how can this mysterious evil from the end of the campaign be impacting what is happening even in the very first moments that your players are active? So villains have a very powerful impact on the goalposts of storytelling, also have a powerful impact on the style and theme of your game. Of the various storytelling elements that we're going to be discussing in this series, villains probably impact style and theme more than any other element that is part of our toolkit as storytellers. The Lich, or the Vile Necromancer, pretty well defines the style and theme of your game. A werewolf has a powerful impact on the style and theme of your game. If you think about almost any villain, you will realize that defining the villain is going to set a large portion of the style and theme of your story. So it is very important here to take some time and think about, what style of game do I want to run? Is my villain appropriate to that style of game? A werewolf can be a fantastic villain, but is probably not the best choice for a deep political intrigue style story. Conversely, if you're trying to do survival horror, a werewolf can be a great villain for that kind of game. Matching the right villain to the right style is very important in good storytelling, and your villain also has a powerful impact on the themes of your story. One of the things that we toyed around with earlier in the story was the idea of redemption. Can your villain be saved? Can they be redeemed? Can they be brought back to the good side? That question of redemption has a powerful impact on the theme of the story you're telling. Redemption is possible and redemption is impossible are two very different types of stories. While these two pieces, villain and style or theme, are very different, villains are going to have a massive impact on how successfully you communicate your style and theme. When you think about your story, when you think about the style of story that you're telling, and the themes you may want to explore in your storytelling, it is important to make sure that your villain matches those particular goals. In fact, a villain who highlights the style and theme of your story is going to be more effective than a mechanically powerful villain that just gets dropped into your game. In one campaign where I wasn't the DM, but rather I was one of the players, I had a character who was enslaved by a dragon. And that dragon was in conflict with Tree Raiser. If you know Galarian's setting and some of its storyline, this dragon was at war with the demon Tree Raiser. And through the course of that campaign, my character had to both confront the dragon that had enslaved him and also had to fight Tree Raiser. And between those two fights, the fight with the dragon that had enslaved my character was much more emotionally engaging because it went with the theme of the story for my character. Yes, I enjoyed getting to fight and defeat Tree Raiser, but that battle with the dragon was personal. Taking the time to make sure that your villain matches the story you're trying to tell is going to be a lot more interesting to your players than just throwing the new powerful monster that got released in whatever book you happen to be holding. So that is an overview of villains and how you can use them as a storyteller in your game. I realize that this video has already gone rather long, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here. But now I'd like to turn the conversation over to you. Is there any element of a good villain that I left out of this video? What do you think makes for a compelling villain? And what things do you think make for less compelling villains as well? Leave your thoughts in the comments down below and be a part of the conversation. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. Subscribe to the channel. We have more material coming out soon. But thank you for joining me and have a wonderful day.